afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to day 3 of the winter school titled EU-Asia Relations in a Multipolar World. The last 2 days have been phenomenal in terms of our discussions on the various facets of EU-Asia relations. And today we're going to kickstart the day with a theme that we have very briefly touched before, and also something that has become the new political buzzword, and that's connectivity and the incremental role that this particular area will play in the future of EU-Asia relations. On this regard, I'm very happy to welcome our guest today, Dr. Anita Prakash. Dr. Anita is a senior policy advisor at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, which is based in Jakarta. She has also previously worked with the Government of India and Niti Aayog. Dr. Anita has also worked extensively on what she calls inclusive connectivity partnership between Europe and Asia. And just last November, Dr. Anita and her team presented a very comprehensive report on cooperation for a more sustainable future for ASEAN, outlining the relevance of connectivity at the 13th ASEAN Summit. Today, of course, she's going to take us through a very detailed presentation on connectivity and EU-Asia cooperation. So over to you, Dr. Anita.
Okay. Thank you very much, Priya, for your very, very kind words and a very substantial introduction. At the very outset, let me put the record straight. I'm afraid I was never lucky enough to get a doctorate degree, so I am just Anita Prakash. But I also hope that my several years of experience in the policy field will compensate for this lack of degree. Yes. So having set the record straight, let me straight away delve into today's session, as the topic is very comprehensive and there are a lot of issues to be discussed here. And the time we have is just 1.5 hours. So I'll try to keep my presentation and lecture about half of the time allotted. And the next half we will use for some discussion arising out of the lecture, or otherwise anything that is on the mind of the participants related to economic integration and connectivity in the Indo-Pacific region, in the context of Asia-EU relations. So with that, I'm straight away going into my presentation. I will share the screen with you at this time. And so I hope everybody can see the slides.
Yes.
Priya, can you confirm, please?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Thank you so much. I'm not really putting it in full screen mode for the simple reason because it is easy to maneuver my computer with all the icons on display. So kindly bear with me for this a bit of untidiness. So Priya has given us the task for speaking about connectivity and economic integration in the Indo-Pacific. But the theme of today's session is, of course, EU-Asia relations in a multipolar world. So what I'll try to do today is that I will organize my thoughts and my lecture in such a manner that we first discuss the EU-Asia relations, the convergences between the two regions, and thereafter speak about connectivity and economic integration in the Indo-Pacific, with a close reference to how EU-Asia relations can actually contribute to the emergence of the new architecture in Indo-Pacific. And for obvious reasons, because my expertise is in the economic architecture of Indo-Pacific, I will not be delving too much into the strategic and security issues, although the two are quite closely related, I must admit. So with that, let me straight away go into the first slide. And yes, so what we are seeing here is the convergence between Asia and Europe as a whole is actually quite immense. We have chosen, we had earlier done comprehensive work on EU-Asia connectivity on several key indicators. Here I have chosen a few which are pertinent to the economic integration and convergences. And as you can see, that the level of integration between Asia and EU is actually quite remarkable. The connectivity between Asia and the EU is something which is also reflective on the common approach to the connectivity in the Indo-Pacific region as well. Asia-EU relations actually can be gauged through several activities. And in this figure, we can actually see that education, research, innovation, movement of people, economy, they all are represented here. About 70% of the trade in goods of Asia-European countries, or at least the countries which are members of ASEAN, takes place with the remaining members. And more than 60% of the investors choose to invest in the other Asia or European country. 60% of internationally mobile students in tertiary education move to at least one or the other Asia or Europe country. So to this extent, we can see here that after trade and investment, education, research, and innovation have been tapped to a very large extent. And all this is thanks to the concerted actions from the EU and from ASEAN and other countries in Asia. So this slide also gives us an idea of the extent of the untapped potential that is there between Asia and EU, which can bring in much more tangible cooperation between the two regions. I move on to trade and economy per se. Please excuse me if the data is a little dated here of 2019. One of the reasons is that after the COVID, we have had some nominal figures coming in, but we have still not filtered them enough. But this gives us a fair idea that the relations between Asia and Europe are actually quite significant in terms of economic connectivity. The trend of market and economy in the Asia-Europe region. But there are a few things to be borne in mind here as we go into 2022, that these figures will now be heavily impacted. This chart will be heavily impacted by certain factors, and the reason being the pandemic itself and its effect on the economy, and liquidity infusion in economies, and the concerns of services sector in Southeast and East Asia, the prospects of a K-shaped recovery in Europe. So all these will require a very, very concerted approach towards rebuilding of demand for goods and services between Asia and Europe, and in the entire Indo-Pacific region per se. It's also perhaps important for us to recognize that in this crisis, our research shows that the incomes in all the regions in Indo-Pacific have been more distressed than international trade itself. So this will require absolutely new strategies for growth, and this must include youth, women, elderly, in one manner or the other. This will become very crucial in this year. We will speak more on this as we move later towards the conclusion part. But let me quickly move on to other aspects of convergence between Asia and EU, and how they will be impacting the growth strategies and growth prospects in the Indo-Pacific region. And one very important element, of course, will be sustainable growth in the coming years. This particular chart shows the SDG achievements in Europe and in Asia Pacific. This figure has been taken from the EU website, and this one is the UNSCAP report. And it is enough to say here that there is a very, very special task here for both EU and Asia for a sustainable economic future ahead. And this is not just for bilateral relations between EU and Asia, but for the entire Indo-Pacific region. Because looking forward, we are moving towards building a better society, resilient and sustainable society. And therefore, implementation of the SDGs will be a very important concern for Asia, developing Asia, and even for Europe. As we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the entire trend towards progress. The UNSCAP, as you can see here, has projected that Asia's progress will be slow or even driven backwards for some of the goals. And in the current trajectory, the Asia-Pacific region will not achieve any of the 17 SDGs by 2030. So accelerated progress is required, is of essential requirement here. And also it is valuable to point out here that the SDG 17, which is very, very pertinent to Asia-EU relations, any lack of progress in this particular SDG could undermine the progress towards all the other SDGs. Because 17 strengthens global partnerships and implementation, means of implementation to achieve the ambitious targets of 2030 agenda. Items like tax revenues, debt sustainability, capacities, technology transfer, cooperation, some sort of a policy coherence and convergence at institutional level, all these are impacted by SDG 17. So this becomes very, very significant for Asia-EU cooperation. And there is one very important lesson here for the entire Indo-Pacific region, considering that this region works on the axis of intra-Asia, Asia-EU, Asia-US, and Asia-Africa also. And it is this, that European countries come closest to achieving the SDGs, but and the 10 countries that are closest to the SDGs achievement are in Europe. So Europe is facing its own challenges, of course, in terms of climate change and biodiversity, sustainable agriculture, etc. But it is my understanding from studying Asia-EU relations for a long, long while is that leadership from EU will be very, very critical in this particular field. Not only because Europe needs to achieve the goal for its own sake, for its own benefit, but also because the 2030 agenda is in some manner a global affirmation of the core values of the EU. The SDGs represent EU's values, And EU can actually use them as part of its external action program. The European Green Deal is a very good example. It is a decisive framework for Europe's sustainable development during the coming decade. And it can be leveraged as an instrument for cooperation with Asia, or at least for developing Asia for achieving the SDGs. And I also believe that EU has tremendous global influence through its intellectual and policy leadership and its leadership in SDG implementation. And therefore, it becomes important for it to support the SDG cooperation program between Europe and Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. Developing Asia and Europe can face climate transition together through greater cooperation. So the EU consensus on development, which has actually been validated for Africa and for Caribbeans, but has not yet been validated for Asia, developing Asia. And so that can become an important vehicle for the pathways ahead. And I've already spoken about the EU Green Deal as an important tool. The next important area of convergence between Asia and EU and its larger impact on the economic integration in Indo-Pacific, or even the growth in Indo-Pacific region, I see that coming from the digital economy. And this chart here, of course, shows we have sort of manipulated some data from the statistics available in the public domain. And what we see here is that there's been a remarkable growth in e-commerce revenues, but there is more to digital economy than just e-commerce. And what we believe here, as you can see in the left side of this chart, there are some measures which have been mentioned for greater cooperation in the digital economy sector. But it is important to believe that digital transformation will have a far-reaching effect on the economies of Asia and Europe in the coming years. And digital economy, many of us are students of this particular area of growth. And we know that the digital economy will be affecting the patterns of and geographical locations of industries, employment, trade. And this is one area where EU and Asia connectivity and cooperation can actually lead in developing a rules-based economy in the sector, in the digital economy sector. Trade and investment strategies remain important, like every time and in and everywhere. But creating standards for data management, taxation, human capital training, these will be very important in the EU-Asia context. And I also understand from the existing policy developments is that if there is a chance for making the digital economy, this is a second chance we are getting as a society. So if there is a chance for making the digital economy embody societal values and inclusiveness, then in that manner, the Asia-EU relations will be very, very important, because EU has moved ahead on policies for consumer protection and privacy, competition, taxation systems. Cybersecurity is of immense concern here. It requires great attention and some amount of global calibration also. So I personally believe that digital economy is a huge chance ahead for EU-Asia relations in a multipolar world, and more so for developing the digital economy in an inclusive manner in Indo-Pacific region. Having spoken enough about the Asia-EU relations in general and their likely prospects for economic integration in the Indo-Pacific architecture, let me come to the specific issue of connectivity and economic integration in Indo-Pacific. This is also my area of expertise, since I have worked on connectivity plans since 2011, starting with the master plan on ASEAN connectivity, which actually popularized the term connectivity in the global strategies for growth. So, which also started the norm for defining connectivity. And then there was a bit of a noodle bowl of connectivity plans. But regardless of this, connectivity plans are actually meant to be international strategies for growth. Connectivity is a recognized pathway for narrowing development gaps among the region and within the region. And as I just said, that the connectivity term was popularized after the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity in 2011. But it is a formal tool for international cooperation and development. And connectivity is now considered indispensable for any form of growth, and even for the achievement of Agenda 2030 and its 17 goals. The concept and practice of supply chain and regional value chains is at the core of East Asia's economic dynamism. And the same can be said for the European community also, where the three freedoms are cherished. So the concept of supply chains, regional value chains, the free movement of labor, capital, and people and services, all these are highly dependent on connectivity, because connectivity integrates national markets and provides connection to the global value chains. And both in physical and institutional terms, connectivity is trade enhancing. But since 2015, as many of you participants would have observed, we have seen a sort of a phenomena of infrastructure initiatives becoming the new geopolitical tool, and creating some sort of rivalries, or even prompting a re-emergence of old rivalries, which were very well buried in the post-war economic growth period. These are very interesting concepts. The new rivalries have been well noted and recorded and commented upon, but the re-emergence of old ones are something very, very region-specific. I can elaborate on that if anyone is interested during the discussion session today, but let us leave it here. Enough to say that connectivity plans have created rivalries, both old and of new variety. On the qualitative aspect of connectivity, and learning from my own experience of studying the connectivity plans in Southeast and East Asia, is that connectivity essentially should, I mean, we know, I have already said that connectivity is a growth strategy, it is trade enhancing, etc., etc. But the fact still remains that it is a facilitator of movement of goods, services, and people, but effectively, on the ground level, connectivity plans should be both growth enhancing and trust enhancing. And they cannot be, the connectivity plans, that is to say, cannot be a foil for regional leadership. And the good lesson of this lies in the earlier development model of Asia-Pacific, where countries like Japan and US were heavily invested in connectivity plans in Southeast and East Asia. But that actually never became a front or a foil for regional leadership, even though by way of largest amount of investment and trade partnership came from these two countries. So having said that, connectivity essentially must be trust enhancing also. And the reason being that supply chains and economic linkages, as much as they depend on physical and infrastructure connectivity, when we say reintegration, what we basically mean here is that the connectivity should be irreversible. That is to say, trust quotients should keep increasing and not decrease by way of some sort of accident or manipulation, because that is the reverse of integration. Integration always moves in the forward manner, which is the reason why I say that trust enhancing factor of connectivity is of vital importance. This will become even more important in digital economy because cybersecurity is something that is endemic to the success of a digital economy. And besides technological capacities, trust will be a very important factor. And the COVID-19 pandemic has actually shown us that unprecedented crisis for connectivity in both developed and developing world we saw it during the pandemic. And what we also saw was that cooperation and not competition actually solved the connectivity disruptions during the pandemic. And this applies well for the future of Indo-Pacific also. The fact that supply chains remained resilient during the pandemic just goes to show that the growth enhancing and the trust enhancing factors of connectivity are of prime importance. Let me just show you the taxonomy of the connectivity plans in Indo-Pacific. The very fact that this particular slide is overdeveloped and looks almost overblown, it is actually a reflection on the way connectivity plans are competing in the region. The Belt and Road Initiative Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, MPAC, I have already said, it is of Asian origin. It aids into the ASEAN community building objectives. It has several elements to it. Those who are students of connectivity can actually look into that at leisure. But what I'm trying to say in this slide here is all the actors who are mainly developing and all the plans that are of strategic importance to the economic integration in the region. So we have ASEAN, we have China, we have EU-Asia connectivity. The first one, the building blocks for strategy on connecting Europe and Asia. And now, very recently, the global gate, EU's global gateway. I'll come back to that in somewhat later in this discussion. There is also the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and there is the ASEAN-India Connectivity Program, which is central to the whole concept of Indo-Pacific economic integration. This is also something we can take up in the discussion phase. And thereafter, we have Japan's partnership with EU on quality infrastructure. We have US also. Now, US has different understanding of connectivity or the way it would pursue it. It is more on strategic lines, but nevertheless, it has not stopped US from actually throwing its hat into the connectivity plan arena, and the development finance cooperation and the technical assistance funds, they are all aimed towards connectivity plans itself, although not as sophisticated and well developed as the other connectivity plans in the Indo-Pacific region. But then again, the US Asia axis of Indo-Pacific is more geared towards strategic issues. But let that not deter people from underestimating the economic value of that axis, because as of now, US has become, after intra-Asian investments, the US has become the second largest investor in the region. So lack of connectivity plans from an infrastructure perspective should not mislead our understanding of the importance that US places on the economic connectivities within Indo-Pacific. And of course, we have Trilateral Highway, which is part of the ASEAN-India Connectivity Program. We have Asian Highway from UNESCAP, the Greater Tumen Initiative running between Mongolia, Russia, and Europe, the Greater Mekong Subregion. This is something very important and is coming up very fast within the Quad's concept of new supply chains. Quad's efforts for new supply chain. I'll discuss this later in another slide that I have. Korea has its own plan. So this is the plethora of connectivity plans that is going around in Indo-Pacific. This particular slide is slightly devoted towards Belt and Road Initiative of China. And the reason is not to explain the elements of BRI here, but to show how the narrative on connectivity plans has become influenced and sort of guided by the very manner in which the Belt and Road Initiative was scoped and later implemented. Given the sheer scope of Belt and Road Initiative, it is important to understand the issues which have been in focus around connectivity plans since the BRI was announced and been implemented since 2015. So China continues to develop the BRI, and it is also recalibrating the initiative as it moves ahead. But, and a lot of us have already heard and read about the sustainability issues arising in many of the countries recipient of the BRI initiative in infrastructure development. But two challenges are very, very important from the economic architecture of Indo-Pacific perspective. And the two challenges that I would like to point out here, by the way, this is also very important for Asia-Europe connectivity also. The first is that cooperation between Chinese and other international actors who are engaged in financing and constructing infrastructure is, this cooperation is rather limited. The projects in which Chinese financiers and contractors are strongly represented are often linked only to the bilateral government-to-government relations. So there is a general air of doubt around the project execution in BRI from an international community perspective. Therefore, it becomes very important that there are synergies and efficiencies created among all the existing connectivity plans in Indo-Pacific. And to achieve a significant degree of mutual strengthening of trust between, let's say, BRI and other non-China connectivity initiatives, this requires a practical effort towards convergence of standards for transparency, fair competition, and even corporate social responsibility for infrastructure financing, construction, and management. And this convergence of standards should apply to all initiatives, whether in transport sector, energy sector, digital infrastructure sector. So the second challenge I would like to point out is the very notable increase in the geopolitical tensions among important players in the Indo-Pacific. And this has led to politicization of international economic relations. I have heard many of my friends and colleagues now actually using the term geoeconomics. I don't know how pure or how technically sound that term is. I would still believe that geopolitics is still the main currency, and politicization of economic relations and economic linkages, that is the way we should be defining it from a pure economic perspective. I'm mentioning this. Participants may differ with me here, but that's all right. This is how I see it, because then it becomes easier to delineate how trade works, how the economics of international trade works, and how geopolitics works. Conflating the two in one term does not do any service to understanding the two and how they influence each other. And I would say that with the geopolitical tensions leading to politicization of international trade relations, this has become even more complicated. It has made the complications more obvious for China and for other governments and private companies to cooperate with each other on large-scale connectivity plans. I understand that small-scale cooperations continue to exist, but we have not seen any announcements or any declarations on a major cooperation on connectivity plans between China and other governments. I would say that a certain level of, I would recommend as a policy observer that a certain level of separation between politics and economics is necessary to enable government agencies and financial institutions, even the civil society, to focus on maximizing international cooperation for infrastructure development and connectivity. I'm hopeful that EU will contribute significantly in bringing the standards for transparency and fair competition in the connectivity plans in Indo-Pacific. There is yet another issue, and it is the acceleration in the implementation of connectivity infrastructure. We know that this has been rather influenced by the trade tensions between US and China. And these trade disputes are leading to some new supply chain connectivities where new centers of production and even consolidation of supply chains are emerging in Asia, in Europe, and even Africa. And it is this emergence of new supply chain linkages in Asia. This will become a very, very important factor in the existing connectivity plans in Indo-Pacific, the very future of the economic architecture of Indo-Pacific. And the rise of new sectors and modes of delivery, that will also impact the connectivity plans. The digital economy, the demand for environmental products, these will also favor a shift towards connectivity plans that will help, developing Asia is particularly influenced by these developments to take advantage of these opportunities in the high income market. And that is where the real future of connectivity plans in Indo-Pacific lies. Having said that, having spoken on connectivity plans, let me show you another taxonomy of connectivity, but this time it is from an economic integration perspective. That was also a part of today's lecture. naturally, this particular slide is more understandable to the author who has created this, but this also runs on a similar pattern from where we had seen the connectivity plans. And in the center, as you can see, is the concept of Indo-Pacific. But in this slide, what we are trying to show is the economic convergences that are coming up in Indo-Pacific, and how Asia-Pacific is now being slowly but surely replaced by Indo-Pacific. So I have already spoken in the previous slide about emergence of new supply chains, the Australia, Japan, India, the Australia, Japan, US, the GMSR I mentioned earlier, the Mekong region being supported by Quad. These, it is commonly understood in economics that supply chains are totally dependent on economic gravity and efficiencies. This is not to say that these linkages are being artificially created outside the economic gravity model, but the fact remains that Indo-Pacific architecture is still relying on economic gravity model, but exploiting the bilateral and trilateral relations more to create new supply chain linkages. And where these are the unexplored areas or the new locations, as I had mentioned earlier, and this is important too, because the old supply chains are all overburdened and in some manner even stagnating, which is why new locations of production and consumption has become very important. And that is what Indo-Pacific is all about. The digital economy will obviously be playing a very important role in this economic architecture. The future of work, because as we know, much of the Indo-Pacific region would constitute of developing countries. Therefore, new economic activities, sorry, let me rephrase this. The new digital economy would be impacting the supply and demand for labor. And therefore, the entire future of work in digital economy would become a very, very important consideration for the Indo-Pacific region. And creating new supply chain and investing in human capital training will be an important element of the economic integration in Indo-Pacific. The two institutional platforms in Indo-Pacific, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the CPTPP, which was earlier the TPP. Now, these are two important vehicles that will remain valid for quite some time. RCEP, of course, is consisting of the East Asia Summit countries. India is, for the time being, out of it. This is something we can discuss later. But the real value of RCEP will lie in bilateral 2 countries or 3 countries really exploiting the supply chains within the RCEP mechanism. The CPTPP, the US has still not come back to it, but China is applying for membership, as is UK, EU. So what we are seeing here is that CPTPP, besides being a very high quality trade agreement, it is the rule setting process in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, is in which all the new applicants are actually interested in. And that is the reason why we see a great future in CPTPP and how the new membership applications are processed in that. That will work on the inclusivity, or as some members would say, the exclusionary element of Indo-Pacific. So that will become a bit of a litmus test, how these membership applications are treated in the future. The role of important members like China, EU, USA, India, these will remain very important. This requires a separate session altogether. But suffice to say here that in terms of investment, we see a great change happening here. Any people who speak of US's diminishing role in Asia, Southeast Asia or East Asia should actually go by statistical evidence. US is now the largest investor in the region. The EU used to be the second largest, but now it is relegated to 4th position, which is still not bad, I would say. And for EU and US to protect their economic and trade and investment in the Indo-Pacific region will be a significant factor for integration here. The global value chain integration, that is to say the trade integration in the region, has a China centrality, no doubt about it. But this integration is also slightly shifting now, although EU has become more integrated with China. But the GVCs are getting more vertically integrated in the region. And that shows that emergence of new supply chain is a real possibility and not an imaginary one. So with that, I will just come to my final slide and put forth some conclusive thoughts on the recovery and rebuilding ahead and how the economic linkages will be in Indo-Pacific will actually promote multilateralism and new supply chains. So this slide is nothing else but a sort of a succinct of all the previous slides. We know that physical space will be very strongly contested in the next few years, and liquidity infusion will be a very serious issue ahead. Developing Asia as a part of Indo-Pacific will have to face this, and most of the growth prospects will be dependent on this liquidity crunch. And that itself will give a reason for creating growth strategies which are much more broad-based and draw from untapped sources. I mentioned women, I mentioned youth, I mentioned elderly, and I also mentioned the untapped sectors of society. The pandemic's effect on the growth, on the achievement to SDGs I've mentioned in great detail. I wouldn't go on that once more, but I will re-emphasize the point on EU's consensus on development and Green Deal coming into the Indo-Pacific growth strategy for sustainable development. That will be very, very important. On digital economy, also we have spoken enough in the past, but what I would like to re-emphasize here, that the future of Asia and EU relations and all the other players in Indo-Pacific, they ought to be very, very realistic towards the ground realities in 2022 and the coming few years, because recovery from the pandemic-induced disruptions and weaknesses will be the primary objective. Thankfully, there is a bright spot here. The pandemic has brought a temporary halt to the regional hegemonic behavior through connectivity plans. But how long this peace will sustain, we do not know. And the challenges for supply chain linkages will remain before us, because disruptions will likely continue in 2022 also. RCEP and CPTPP, as I said, will help to some extent, but new growth strategies will be very, very important. Last but not the least, because the topic today was the relations in multipolar world, this pandemic has also revealed the gaps in multilateral action towards sustainable development, financial stability, and international trade. We all know that in this pandemic, it is the incomes which have been more negatively affected, and in all societies. The trade has been impacted, but not as much as the incomes. So the strategies of growth must become more inclusive, and building back trust in connectivity and connectivity-related technologies will be a very important task. This includes cybersecurity too. So bringing down the barriers to movement of people and goods and services through international cooperation. This will be the true test for both Asia-EU relations in the coming years and for the entire economic architecture of Indo-Pacific. So I must end here. I've spoken enough, but I look forward to a good discussion ahead. Thank you, Priya. Can you overtake from here and moderate the discussions, please?
Thank you very much, Anita ma'am, for that very comprehensive presentation. You highlighted, of course, presented to us all the different kinds of connectivity plans that we see emerging in the Indo-Pacific. And now, of course, I open the floor to all our participants for discussion, but I think I already see a hand raised. Yatharth, yeah.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very, very informative presentation. I have a very quick question. You know about connectivity strategies, but what we see today is competing connectivity strategies, which have become a core element of geopolitics in this 21st century. In fact, according to some scholars, we have come into this age of hyper connectivity. Hyperconnectivity has begun, and they have a lot of people have are saying that it's almost equivalent to the arms race in 21st century. So my question is, how do you assess the possible consequences of this, this new multiplicity of connectivity strategies, how it is going to impact us in future? Thank you.
Priya, are we going to take a few questions together, or are we going question to question?
I'll leave it to you to decide. Would you like 2-3 questions taken simultaneously, or you want to respond one by one to each question? Which one would you prefer?
It's okay. Let me reply to what Yatharth has asked, because yes, the competing connectivity strategies, of course, we dwelt upon it to a great extent in today's presentation. The reality, let me put it like this, Yatharth. What we read is the obvious problem, but the real issues, the ground realities, actually lie elsewhere. For example, while we hear a lot about competing interests in connectivity, it is the absence of a rules-based system. I spoke about standards several times in my presentation today. It's the absence of standards for connectivity infrastructure in an international perspective. Those are which are creating the current problems, because you will note that debt sustainability is becoming a very serious issue within the connectivity plans. The competition that you speak of is not really about politics per se, but it is the benefit to the civil society that is the real issue here. Unfortunately, it is the competing interest of the promoter countries which hog all the limelight, but that perhaps is not the real issue on which we should be concentrating upon. How efficient is the connectivity plan per se for the recipient country, that is to say? And when I say efficient, I mean in terms of investment, repayment conditions, build, operate, transfer conditions, technology transfer compulsions, and so on and so forth. The debt issue, of course, comes within the repayment conditions itself. So it is actually the terms and conditions of the competing connectivity plans and the lack of standards therein that are the real issue, and on which we should be concentrating more, rather than whether the project was backed by China under BRI or whether Japan got the metro rail project in Indonesia or did not get in this particular case. So they make good headlines, but the real issue is how far countries are able to exercise their independence in decision-making process, in connectivity plan selection and implementation. I spoke about how far, in case of BRI, that was just an example, but let me tell you that is true for many connectivity plans in other countries also. Maybe not so much in such a detailed manner, but the fact remains that government procurements, supply orders, how internationalized they are within connectivity plans, those are the real issues. And that is why if we see conflict, actually they are emerging from the lack of standards and transparencies in these connectivity plans, not per se for investments and returns, although that remains the primary motive always and always. Any connectivity plan must be investment returning plan. It cannot be built for service purpose. By the way, that is also one of the reasons why PPP projects never really take off. But that is the whole economics of it. Since we are discussing the politics of the connectivity plans, let me say that it is the investment conditions that should get more notice than the sheer presence of competition. Competition is obvious. One should not take competition as a negative thing. It's the conditions created from competition that is what is really, because let me also underline one thing here, Yatharth, is that availability of finance is a huge issue in developing countries. And one should not underestimate the investments being made available by many of the connectivity plans, even though if, they lead to tensions later on. So I come back again to the issue of creating international standards for this. And this will become more and more important when digital economy connectivity issues are in place, because that's the future of connectivity. And that will become even more serious because cybersecurity, etc., are very, data sharing, data transfer, these will be very important areas of consideration. Have I been able to answer your concern, Yatharth?
Yes,
Not
thank
important.
you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Abhishek and then Rishabh.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is little deviating from, as you said, not exactly on economics, but on patents and related things between India and EU. So we know that in 80s and 90s, when we had this partnership with Japan, and we still have this issue of patents with Japan, and we still don't develop jointly technology. I mean, there is a technology transfer and all, and I worked in Europe, I'm studying in Europe. I mean, I see this problem very prominent even in India-EU relationship.
Yes.
We work together, we do this, we do that. But the problem is when it comes to work together on developing a technology. And very recently, you could see in, COVID thing, Germany was not at all very happy with what we were doing in India for vaccine development and pricing issues and all. So, ma'am, what is your opinion? Like, because that is very important as we grow going forward.
Yeah. I'm assuming you are asking this question from an Indian perspective, not precisely from an Indian. Yeah. No.
No, ma'am. I'm thinking that like when we talk about research, education, higher education research, when we work as an individual or as a group, I mean, there has to have some sort of like level playing thing, no? Not necessarily between. I mean,
Abhishek, the short answer to this question is to see how EU's investments and EU's collaboration in Southeast Asia are working, and why India is not getting a similar experience out of India-EU relations. For example, let's set aside investment in industries, patents, and technology transfer to one side. Let's just take up the issue of education and research and innovation exchanges. Why is it that the EU-ASEAN program is more successful here, and why they are able to better exploit the, let's say, expertise of EU? So the thing here is, I mean, since I'm in that part of the world and I see the EU program working very well there, the reason being that, of course, Europe has some, how should I put it? It has a historical context, historical presence in that region. So the element of cross-ownership of ideas and institution is already prevalent in those countries. And therefore, it becomes very easy for Indonesia to exchange with Germany and Netherlands, for Malaysia to do with UK, for Singapore to do with the whole Commonwealth of nations, including UK. So I personally feel that that sort of a historical connect, which used to exist in India, was disconnected at some point or the other. And the new policies that we brought in were almost de novo, if I may say so. And to that extent, we had to enter the race from the beginning, so to speak. That is one thing. The second thing, and this is very important, the first one was more intuitive and anecdotal explanation. This one is a more factual one. The institutional arrangements between Southeast and East Asia and EU, and why that system is more successful, is that the barriers to institutional barriers are very low there, as opposed to India-EU relations. That's one thing. And the second thing, and this is of course very obvious to any student of economics and politics, is the sheer size of India's politics and India's market. We are now going to be the 6th largest economy. Now that number is a very, it's a big giveaway for any relationship between a developed and developing country. It's a different matter that India's potential always remains in potential terms only. We hope to see in our lifetime to it becoming a reality. But that potential is a real one. It's not a creation or imagination. So that brings inherent rivalries. And as I said, that the two parties have not worked enough on their institutional lowering of barriers, institutional barriers, despite having huge markets, exchangeable markets, that is to say. Why is it that ASEAN is more integrated, the value chains in ASEAN are more integrated with Europe as opposed to India? Of course, our manufacturing sector is not as improved as other parts of Asia. So that is a very obvious reason. So it's both a question of investment and institutional barriers. If those are lowered, we will see a better engagement and better exchange of both finances and technology. And movement of people. Movement of people, that's a very important issue, including education. Yeah.
Right, I hope that answers your question, Abhishek. We move to Rishabh.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, my question is related to digital economy. How does the current connectivity plans determine to address the digital autonomy of every country that participates in it, considering the fact the capability of digital infrastructures acting as an earpiece or even as an eyepiece of one country within another.
Thank you, Rishabh. I'm not exactly a digital economy expert, but I would say this to you. We are more concerned on policy convergence and how to connect digital economy into the growth strategies in developing Asia. But having said that, let me try to answer your question. That digital economy is here to stay, but what we are seeing in digital economy and the kind of autonomy that the issue you are raising, that is an inherent conflict that all the countries are now facing, is to how to create the localization within the global nature of digital economy, because digital economy is effortlessly global as opposed to a manufacturing economy where you have to create conditions to be connected to each other. So in that context, the autonomy will really come from the technology itself and agreements on how far the exchange of technology or the connectivity of the platforms and the highways, how those are governed, where the right of one country starts and where it stops, that sort of an agreement needs to be created. And that's what we are working towards, although the agreement is still far, far ahead. And because that is not going to come anytime soon, which is why we are now seeing this emergence of digital trade agreements, bilateral ones, trilateral ones. Again, Southeast Asia and East Asia is taking a lead in that, So what we see is an Australia-Singapore agreement. We see an Australia-New Zealand, Chile-Singapore agreement, So already we are seeing some pilot projects emerging, how to maintain autonomy even while getting converged into a digital economic market, The whole rules-making process is highly fragmented at this point of time. The EU has been able to create for itself because it is a community. ASEAN is creating a similar one for itself. Again, ASEAN is an economic community. But these are the examples, and I mentioned this in my lecture today earlier, that these examples will have to be mainstreamed, just the way the G20 recently agreed on taxation systems in digital economy. So that is how the evolution must take place. And autonomy will be guaranteed, but it will come in form of technological capacities and some common sharings. And for that, I personally feel that the developed countries, let's say the US, the EU is governed by its own standards. Asia is still developing. US is highly developed, but is totally committed to the free market and private players. So it is bringing these diverse entities onto one common platform. For example, India's resistance to data sharing, that is something which you have to bring sort of halfway closer to the international norms of data sharing. So what we are now preparing is a proper recipe for an international rules-based system for digital economy. That is what we are moving towards. And the bilaterals and trilaterals are the beginning of that.
All right. Before I get to Rishabh, something that we've been discussing so far has got me a little provoked into thinking, is an effective decoupling of politics from economics possible in the case of the connectivity partnerships? Just wondering about that. You mentioned that there is a need for separation of geopolitics from geoeconomics. So I was just wondering along that lines, how do we actually sort of decouple these two, especially when it comes to, connectivity.
Yeah. Because when WTO was established, I mean, regardless of the current commotion that's going on in WTO, the WTO governed the international trading system, which created equal conditions for both developing and developed world. That is to say, the conditions for participation in international trade were equalized. We require a similar trading environment for digital economy. And that's what I was trying to answer to Rishabh previously. But if you will recall the pathways towards WTO, and it never got fully resolved, and most of the gaps that were left unsued, so to speak, in Seattle way back, they have now come home to roost, and the current logjam in WTO as we see it. And here I'm not talking about the US-China issue. Here I'm talking about the conflict between the developed and developing countries, most of which was left unattended. But regardless of that, I mean, to dispose of WTO is not the answer. It is to improve and sort of rectify the issues. We are looking for a similar standards and a rule-based order for the digital economy. And that is why I also mentioned in my lecture was that this is a second chance where, among other standards of economic exchange and cooperation are factored, the societal values also get factored in. This is a chance we are getting all over again. And that is why leadership on competition and fair practices, on transparency, those become very important, and EU's leadership will be very important on that, because as a community, they have been working on it for quite some time. We don't expect it to be perfect, but at least there is a model ahead, which can be taken as a starting point.
All right, thank you.
And the fact, Priya, that digital economy, just the way the global value chain crisscrossed each other across the continents. There is a very famous chart. If I had it readily available, I would have shown it to you. But in a similar crisscross manner, the digital economy would completely overtake all the continents in terms of connectivity, something like the airlines routes chart,
I have seen that chart. That's the one with the global value chains. I think
yes.
You shared all the interconnected dots.
Yeah, because I work on supply chains very closely, so I use that chart very, very often. The ITC Geneva is the author of that particular chart. So with this plethora of platforms and highways in digital economy, it's a no-brainer to believe that an international regulatory platform is required. Yeah.
Rishabh, I saw that you had your hand raised. Do you still have a question? No?
Yes, ma'am, I do have it actually. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, actually, I thought that actually there won't be any time there. So I actually decided
No, please go on. We'll take Rishabh, Anand, and Anita.
Okay. Ma'am, I would actually like to know that basically what are the categories required for a proper infrastructure project to be acceptable worldwide? Because ma'am, we see the debt trap diplomacy of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now we see an infrastructure project by the European Union, and we have the Build Back Better infrastructure initiative also by President Joe Biden. So ma'am, ultimately, how do countries understand and which is beneficial for them, and essentially are these projects more constructive, or actually just built to actually expand influence? How would you actually see it, ma'am? Ma'am, and also one thing, I actually enjoyed your presentation a lot. After the thing actually ends, would you mind actually sharing the slides with us, if you? Yes, ma'am.
To answer the last question first, Rishabh, not at all. Please ask Priya. Priya has a copy of my PPT today. Very happy to share with you all. And much of many of the earlier slides of today's presentation came from the latest book. The later ones are from a different the work that I have done on supply chains. So the source you may not find here, but the reading material that has been given to you is the basis on which the first few slides were. So Priya will, I'm sure, will share it with you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no mention. So the first part of your question, again, let me emphasize. Oh, by the way, Priya, I will also send a link to the policy brief that I wrote for the Saudi Arabian G20 chairmanship for the task force on infrastructure investment. You can share that with Rishabh and anybody else who is interested in that. So that particular policy brief wholesomely addressed the question that Rishabh is asking just now, except that there is a political element to it, to the question. Rishabh, I'll share the link with Priya and you can access the policy brief there. So to come back to your question, Rishabh, ultimately, infrastructure projects are all about investments and return on investments. It's a pure and simple economic activity. And therefore, to invest in any project which has not equal or more than equal returns is out of question. That's one part of the issue. The second issue is that when connectivity plans cross borders, these issues do not arise as much when the connectivity plans are within a country's border. Therefore, within the country borders, it is more about revenue management and civil society expectations. But the moment the connectivity plans cross border, it's all about returns on investment and whether the promoter country, because the promoter country, for example, a BRI investing in Montenegro, I think many of us have read about this particular example. China's and BRI's investment in Montenegro is not exactly contributing to China's trade with Europe, right? What China is looking forward to is the returns, that is to say, the interest payment on the investments that is being done. It's almost like a banking activity where the principal is not important. It is the annual returns that are important. So here, and in the bargain, if you are also getting a hegemonic presence, then that is all the more better. Although this calculation is no longer working, and the rest of the world is very closely watching the BRI model of hegemonic influence and to see its limited capacities of this model. And I mean, of course, for a large part of the last 5 or 6 years, the entire world was led to believe that this is the way to create your political influence in a country or a region. But we find that story unraveling, and not just Europe, in Africa also. So having said that, infrastructure projects are all about investments and return on investments, and they have to be purely adjudged on that basis. And now there is an additional element to it. That is to say, how fairly attuned a project planning is to climate action and climate changes, and whether those costs have been factored into the plans or not. The ADB has done exemplary work on this particular issue. So that is the reason why we say that there is an impossible triad of infrastructure investment: sustainability, investment returns, and goods. All the three cannot be matched at the same time. At least one has to be, has to be surrendered to achieve the remaining two. So as we see what worked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where connectivity plans actually led to your hegemonic relationships also, and to some extent BRI was successful in that, I don't think that model is working anymore. Now it has become all about economic sustainability of the project, returns from the project, and how well the countries are able to. And so far, none of the examples, except perhaps in Central Asia, we don't see any major influences coming out, whether it is Sri Lanka or Pakistan or Montenegro. I mean, Maldives, these have become textbook examples actually to disprove the issue, the point that it is the promoter's influence that is important in a connectivity plan.
Thank you so much. Anita ma'am, if you don't mind, we'll take last 3 questions together and then
Yes, please.
close. All right, Anand, Alisa, Veronica, one by one, please.
Absolutely. So thank you, ma'am. My question has to do more with the way Europe is handling its carbon taxations, as in it has its own plan of, taxing nations or companies with regards to the carbon output that they produce. And when we look at the ASEAN region as a whole, we see that it is the next manufacturing hub right now, and as such, given its developing nature, it is more likely to pollute the environment in a way. So how will Europe look at the carbon taxation perspective of it, and whether it's looking to maybe look at a compromise in its principle so as to achieve better trades or better trade ties or better economic conditions? So I think that's my question. Over to Alicia.
Okay, so thank you, ma'am, for the presentation. I had 2 questions. So I wanted to know, like, what do you feel about the rise of AI technology? Like, considering that technology right now is like, it can either be used to facilitate the connectivity in the Indo-Pacific region, or it can be used as a weapon itself. So, like, your views on that. And the second one the second question is that how, like, the framework for the AI technology in the region, because if we see that individual countries like Singapore, China, they have their own frameworks in place for it. But overall, for Indo-Pacific region, like, how will there be will there be a consensus, or is there any framework in process to develop one? So I just had that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica.
Yes. Okay. I would like to hear your opinion on the volunteer withdrawal of India from RCEP. And actually, even in terms of CPTPP, India also mentions that it would like to keep distance. So for me personally, I find it's a strategy loss for India. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Excellent question. Yeah, AI technology. Please, I really must caution all my participants here, including those asking questions, is to not really go by the sensational headings that we read in newspapers, etc., but to actually go into statistical and data production of from authorized bodies. Let's say IMF. They don't do it regularly, but they have produced an excellent report on how AI technologies will be affecting labor conditions in most part of the world. So in that context, what I would like to say here is that why should we look at AI technologies from weaponization perspective? It's an opportunity. We understand that AI contributes immensely to the growth prospects of a country. to those countries which have it and those countries which are aspiring to be to include AI in their economic prospects. I personally believe, from all that I have read and researched, is that the AI's actual effect is really on the way labor is engaged, the way goods and services will be produced, where they will be produced. That is to say, I look at AI mostly from an economic perspective, and which is why we are always speaking in terms of creating some sort of a leveling field for developing countries, developing Asia in this case. AI is a connecting tool, no doubt about it. Why would we even see it as some sort of, since you use the word, weaponization, for the simple reason is that, answering Rishabh earlier, I had already mentioned that standards and values and rule-making processes are required for the digital economy, new digital economy. But having said that, the AI's real effect is on labor market. We still have not been able to calculate, because AI is prevalent in spots. We don't have a contiguous presence of AI in manufacturing and in markets altogether. So it is very difficult to judge which country is actually profiting more from its position and innovations in AI. When it's very easy to compare countries in the formal economic sector, but from an AI and digital perspective, it is difficult to assess which country has progressed more and therefore is likely to use it, as you would put it, against any other country, or as a detriment to the economic architecture in Indo-Pacific. So we would prefer to see AI as a connectivity tool, but what we would more prefer is to see what is AI's effect on the labor market. How far can AI actually substitute for labor? What sort of displacement behaviors that countries need to put in place in order to compensate where AIs have taken? Because we know that AIs favor skilled labor, but are highly disfavorable to unskilled labor. So it is the study and of these issues and creating conditions for leveling out the field that is more the need than to go by sensationalization of the fact that AI would somehow detriment, participation in these innovative technology is an inevitability in one manner or the other. But this is not to say that traditional manufacturing is going to go away. It's finding the policy balance really is what Indo-Pacific as a whole and countries individually that need to do. And in order to do that sort of a policy balance, you really need to have all the facts and figures before you. What is AI's substitutability factor in labor market? How is productivity impacted by AI, and so on and so forth? All the basic questions of policy making, creating the evidences, so to speak. That is how I see it. I may or may not have answered your question in full, but I personally believe that from an AI as a tool of growth, this is how I see its application in the region. I missed the first question in answering the AI one. So let me go back to carbon taxation and then I'll come back to you, Veronica. Carbon taxation, yes, very interesting. East Asia has reacted a little strongly to EU's carbon taxation policy. But we must remember that so far it is applicable only to 4 items, if I'm not mistaken. Cement, aluminium, and 2 more. Yeah, steel.
It was one of them.
Yeah. Then it is wrong to assume and to say that manufacturing would affect climate conditions ahead. Manufacturing is an integral part of economy and international trade. It is not going to go away. And to say that manufacturing impacts negatively climate issues is also not correct, because there are ways and means which have been now perfected of cleaner technologies. And then there is a balancing act also, that what you produce here is compensated in another field, as you say, footprints, because ASEAN is not going to be a manufacturing hub. It is already a manufacturing hub. So it is already seeing the impact that manufacturing has on climate change and other elements of sustainability, including. But the real challenge here is to balance between livelihood and growth, and what you would call is the compensation for climate effect on activities that affect the climate issues. It is the future of economic cooperation actually lies in creating cleaner conditions in the manufacturing process. Again, Europe is leading in this, in creating a market for environmental friendly goods, and to which ASEAN is contributing very closely. So, so there are actually 2 issues which we are looking at here, which are distinct from each other, is to say that manufacturing will continue, but it must continue under much more improved conditions, and that carbon taxation has not been welcomed equanimously in ASEAN region or even the East Asia region. But this is not to say that the EU policy on carbon taxation is in any manner wrong. It is a little ahead in time for the manufacturing hub that is East Asia. And you may like to also note here for students of European community is that Europe is actually losing its manufacturing capacities to other parts of Asia. So what we are looking at here is not exactly purely a climate control issue, but it is more of an economic competitiveness issue, that whether the carbon taxation is actually undermining the competitiveness of East Asian manufacturing region, or whether it is purely a tool for betterment of climate. So it is this policy conflict that is actually, that needs to be clarified in the longer run, both by EU and by Asia. Veronica, India outside RCEP, my favorite topic. Lost opportunity for both for the East Asia summit countries and for India. Of course, you cannot really question a sovereign country's decision for maintaining its policy options, including creating a kind of policy independence in terms of international trade. RCEP is still open to India if and when it is ready to join. And actually, given the size of India's economy and the size of India's market, all the RCEP member countries are eager that India should come back to it. On that positive note, let me add a question that all the students here should go home and debate. Yes, India has created an independence for itself in terms of trade policy, international trade policy. The real question to ask here is, what will India do with this independence? How are you going to use this independence? Will you be inflicting, despite the negative connotation of the word inflicting, are you going to inflict independent tariff regulations on other countries' exports and imports? Would you be setting up independent custom rates for other countries' exports and imports to India, from India? So the moot point here then is that how are you going to use this independence? Yeah. And independence of international trade, that is to say. And closely associated with this is another question, which is not exactly a part of RCEP, but is endemic to India's decision to stay outside RCEP, is the industrial policy announced in India, that is to say, Make in India 2.0. Again, creating a local value chain, as has been often said in the second Make in India version, it's all well and good. You can, and India may be able to create its internal value chains, all local, but you still need to send it outside, which again, we are doing to a large extent, but we are creating a bit of a recipe for shocks and turbulence ahead, because international linkages are better able to absorb shocks and disturbances as opposed to internally controlled production processes where value chains do not extend outside the country. So despite the China centrality of value chains in the RCEP region, it is still an act of boldness to go out and face it sooner rather than wait for it to happen later, when all the rules-making process has already been occupied and taken by other countries. For example, if UK is, China I can understand coming to CPTPP, but if UK is willing to, has thrown in its application, it's not for purpose of trade. I mean, that will happen. It's for purpose of being a part of the rules-making process in Indo-Pacific region. You can't be seen to be missing in action here. As of date, India professes to be a founder member of every significant international institution, rules-making institution, including the UN Charter, which is the sort of synonym for a rules-based order. So, because value chains operate regionally, global is a misnomer. Value chains are actually regional in nature. And if you're not a part of the rules-making process, so that will, that's an issue here. So, so that's how things stand as of today, Veronica. But yeah, the real question is that autonomy, the proof of autonomy lies in exercising it against a group of people, a group of countries, 2, 3, multiple, mini plurilateral, multilateral. Independent bilateral processes are very, very taxing. I mean, I understand that that is the way India wants to move forward bilaterally with each, but it is hugely taxing, time consuming, non-efficient.
I hope that answers your question, Veronica. And of course, we'll also continue this discussion in the next session, where again, we're just going to discuss exclusively EU-Asia relations and trade. So then thank you so much, Anita ma'am, for providing us this, I mean, almost deconstruct this entire connectivity, the complex nexus of connectivity, and also engaging with our participants effectively. So thank you so much. Last words, anything you would like to share before we close?
Yes, Priya, this may not be related to the winter school per se, but the fact is that the EU-Asia cooperation model, the cooperation process, is very close to your center's mandate. And it is a very influential factor in the economic architecture emerging in Indo-Pacific. So this session, of course, was a very long one, and the participants had to bear to listen to it. But there is a lot more to be deconstructed. So perhaps writing would be a very good way of doing it. Shorter notes, but exchanged more regularly, and short reads.
Yeah.
Short reads, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.